But first, let's talk about two of the most controversial subjects in human existence and how they can lead people down some very funny rabbit holes indeed. Now, I'm not talking about sex or money, though they are also closely related to what we are talking about, namely religion and politics. Now, religion and politics is kind of a funny thing. A lot of people think you should never mix one with the other. The combination is just too combustible. Well, I disagree. I think you can't understand one without understanding the other. Take Anthony Albanese. He has often joked that he was brought up with three faiths: the Catholic Church, the South Sydney Rabbitohs, and the ALP. But you know what? I think it is fair to say that he is also an adherent to another more modern religion: science, as in capital S science. The science of the science is settled, not the science of constant questioning and uncertainty. Back in 2020, when the pandemic was just kicking off, here's what the PM had to say about science.
What unites them all is curiosity and a vision of a better way of doing things. Today I want to talk about how that spirit can take us forward. For years, science has been taking a pounding, and that perversity that we call the culture wars. A pandemic has snapped us back to reality.
Science is reality. And since then, he has invoked the holy blessed science plenty of times to back in not just his preferred approaches to COVID, but also his government's policies on climate. So, imagine my surprise to wake up this morning to find that Anthony Albanese is, on this subject, a bit of a heretic. Or perhaps some other word beginning with H. You see, the other day, as discussed here, Albo imposed a new border testing requirement for travelers coming in from China. It's not that onerous, just a negative PCR test, but it is unnecessary. And his own chief medical officer, Paul Kelly, a high priest of science, if you will, was against it. In a letter revealed this morning, it turns out that Professor Kelly told the PM he did not think there was sufficient evidence for imposing restrictions on China and Chinese travelers, despite COVID being rampant there. Indeed, it has been revealed that Health Minister Mark Butler imposed mandatory COVID-19 tests for travelers to Australia from China, despite the CMO finding the measure was, quote, disproportionate to the risk. Now, one of the key reasons, of course, that it was disproportionate is that COVID is also rampant here. Australia, the incredibly helpful Worldometer's website tells us, has something like the 16th highest number of new cases in the world. An amazing accomplishment for a nation that, for a time, was second only to China in its love of locking people up for their own good. And we know that number is likely far higher because even persnickety rule-following Australians have, for the most part, stopped telling anyone connected with officialdom if they test positive, with growing numbers of people just acting normally and staying home if they feel a bit crook. Imagine that. China, meanwhile, has basically stopped reporting its COVID cases altogether because no one has ever trusted their figures in the first place, and if they did publish them, the number of zeros would run off the edge of the page. Yet, the country which terrified the world with what were in retrospect hilariously slapstick viral videos of COVID sufferers collapsing in the streets is now seeing something like 1 million people infected every day. Indeed, even some of the old COVID fundamentalists are changing their tune. Professor Raina McIntyre, who once suggested that if you could smell your neighbors cooking, you might catch their COVID, seriously, called the idea out on Twitter the other day. She said the point of closing borders is to prevent infection coming in when there is none or little domestically, she tweeted. There is little point when infection is rampant in the community, as it is here in Australia. So, what's going on here? How do we explain this? Well, again, I think this has something to do with religion and politics. The left has long treated science as a substitute religion, sometimes under the other name of reason, such as after the French Revolution. But always they did this with the implication that this is the real truth, and you can leave those old superstitious fights about religion, God, and faith at the door. If only. Because when it comes to COVID and climate change and gender and a host of other issues, science has not only taken a beating, but it has taken on a religious tone. And there are plenty of fundamentalists. So who do you think Albo is listening to? Well, just as he listens to the most extreme views on climate, which means the country is going to have to spend what he recently admitted at the Woodford Festival would be hundreds of millions of dollars making the transition, rather than even countenancing sinful nuclear power, he seems to be listening to the extremists on COVID as well. Extremists such as Monique Ryan, the Teal Independent from Kooyong. You remember her, don't you?
COVID-19 infections in this country are at a record high and increasing. Can the Minister please explain how he proposes to manage the oncoming national significant burden of disability and chronic illness? Put your masks on. From repeated infection.
Order.
Did you hear? Put your masks on. Anyway, Monique Ryan, that's Dr. Ryan to you, thank you very much, recently tweeted, "So, time to require pre-travel testing of all travelers entering Australia from Europe, the US, Africa, and Asia, and maybe reinstate other public health measures as well?" Oddly, the graph she tweeted along with the article seemed to suggest that if anything, COVID peaks were going down, not up, as actual, not fundamentalist science predicted. And then there was Roderick McRae, the doctor who is the head of the Victorian branch of the Australian Medical Association, such a reliably left-leaning outfit that I like to call them the CFMEU with stethoscopes. Anyway, Dr. McRae said the passengers from China landing in Melbourne should be quarantined for a week. Great. Back to that. And of course, all the other Twitter hysterics are out there for whom COVID has given life meaning and an entire ethical, dare I even say religious system, complete with ceremonial dress like masks and cleanliness rituals and goodies and baddies. So, does this mean that there are other COVID restrictions coming down the pike at us? Well, look, unlike members of the Labour cabinet, I'm not an alarmist. So I'll say probably not. But what I will say is that this is a pretty telling episode that everyone should remember whenever the PM or anyone else on the Labour side of politics says that they are the font of all wisdom because they trust the science and have taken it into their hearts. Because by elevating science from methodology, a way to ascertain facts and maybe make life better for people along the way, to something more akin to a faith, the progressive left has opened the door to fanatics. That's why we see such fundamentalist maximalism everywhere this happens, from the accusations that people who disagreed with lockdowns wanted to sacrifice the elderly on the altar of the economy, to the claim that the economy, again, must be torched to save the planet. Once you see that religion and politics aren't opposites as much as opposite sides of the same coin, everything becomes a little clearer.